Hello and welcome, this is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to share some foiled and pressed modern botanical cards using this new modern botanical collection from Dina Wakley and Spellbinders. Her collections are always unique and this is no exception. So we have two registration press plate sets that have a combination of botanicals with some different modern elements. And then we have two embossing folders. There's this one here, which is lined corners. That's a 3D embossing folder. And this one, which is lined circles, which is a 2D embossing folder. And for these cards, this is my color palette inspiration. That's a card from the DIY deck. So those are the colors that I'm going to be using. So I'm going to start by foiling a couple of my images. I'm going to do the botanical images from each one of those press plate sets. So when I'm doing the foiling, I am matching up my press plate with that registration template. We are not using the registration template with the Glimmer system. I don't think the heat with that acetate would be a very good combination, but I'm just using it for some placement. Now, if it's not placed exactly, you can tell by the arrangement of the botanicals and the different elements that a little bit of change is going to be fine. It's not, these aren't designs that need absolute perfect placement, but I did like the placement, I like the arrangement, so I wanted to get it somewhat close. So I used some Best Ever craft tape on the side, and I chose the side that was as straight-ish as possible, and put the press plate face up, lined on that registration template just to use as a guide. Then put my paper down on top of it, matching my paper with the frame that's on the registration template. And this way that press plate gets taped in place, and then I put the foil underneath it. And I tried to trim my foil down so it wasn't too big to get some over foiling. I am saving my negative pieces and I'm going to do some negative hot foiling. And then I'm going to repeat that same process with the second registration template botanical. So once again, I'm matching it on my template. Now, when I get products from Spellbinders, they are often samples, so they're not always perfect. So one of these registration templates, the Betterpress writing on it shows up the right way, and the other one, it shows up the wrong way. So it doesn't really matter which way you do it for what I'm doing here, as long as your press plates match, you want to be using it that way. So I'm going to put that Best Ever craft tape on the back of my press plate, place it on that registration template so that the pattern side is facing up, then put my paper down on top of it, making sure that that Best Ever craft tape tapes to my Hammermill cardstock here. And I'm doing my foiling on Hammermill cardstock. Then I flip it over and I move that registration template to the side. Once again, I'm not using that template on the Glimmer system here. I'm only using it as a guide for placement. Then I put the foil pretty side to the plate and then put it on my Glimmer system, press the timer button, and once that timer button goes off, I put it through my Platinum 6 machine. Now, the previous collection from Dina Wakley and Spellbinders had some sentiments, so I'm going to be using those sentiments for these cards. So I'm doing two different foils here. You may have noticed the first card was done with some prism foil. The second card was done with coffee bean foil. And I wanted to just see the arrangement with different colors with the two different foils. I thought it would be interesting to see them. For the second two, I'm doing 4 cards total in this video. For the second 2 cards, I'm going to only be using my Betterpress system. So if you don't have a foil or the Glimmer hot foil system, you can do a similar look in your Betterpress system. So I'm going to be sharing that with the second 2 cards. So for the sentiments, they're called Holding Your Heart sentiments. And like I said, these are from a previous collection with Dina Wakley. I'm doing it with both of the foils, both the coffee bean and aura foil. And I'm also going to be doing the negative hot foiling with those sentiments as well. So I'm going to create a ton of sentiments all at once. I am not going to use all of them. There's going to be a ton of extra ones. I just put them in a Ziploc bag and put them right with that press plate and die set. So then I know next time I'm going to be using that collection. If I want one of those sentiments, I have a bunch of them done and one of them might work for what I'm doing. So when it comes time to do the solid hot foiling, I put my solid hot foil plate onto the base, and I do wait for a little bit for it to heat up to make sure that I have a nice hot plate. Put the plate or put the foil with the pretty side towards that solid hot foil plate, and then another piece of Hammermill cardstock on top of it. For this particular one, I'm going to actually be using this piece as a mat around one of my images, but you can easily die cut them and use them as solid hot foiled sentiments as well. This second one here, this coffee bean one, it goes a little bit crooked, so it's not going to work as a mat. So I will die cut it. Any of the sentiments that go off the edges and don't die cut properly, I'll just discard them right away. It will still leave me with a ton of sentiments to use. So once I'm done solid hot foiling my sentiments, I'm also going to solid hot foil those 2 botanical pieces. Now, the only one I'm going to be using in the cards that I'm creating today is the one that has the matching die. One of the sets have a matching die with it. The other one does not. You could easily fussy cut it if you want, but I opted not to do that for this particular video. So the one that has the die is the one that was done with the Aura foil. And I just thought it would be a nice element right on top of the foiled and better pressed background. So to do the die cutting, I always tape my die in place with some Best Ever craft tape. And you'll notice I have 2 different widths here of the Best Ever craft tape. I use the thin one when I am taping dies to my cardstock. I use the thick one for holding that glimmer plate to my cardstock before putting the glimmer foil between it, because the thicker tape just sticks a little bit better. There's just a little bit more surface holding it. So I like to use that one for that, but I don't need it quite that thick for taping my die to it. So when it comes time to doing the sentiments, to die cut them, I do exactly the same thing. I tape that die down, run it through my machine. The same die, there's 1 die and 2 plates in that Holding Your Heart sentiments set. The same die works with all of those sentiments, or with both of those plates. So once I'm done one, I just flip it over, match it to the other one, tape that tape in place, and do my die cutting. So I always like to do this ahead of time so that I have all of my pieces foiled and die cut ready to go. So when it comes time to creating, I just have to pick out what sentiment I want to use, whether it's a regular foiled or solid hot foiled one. And I'm going to be using a combination, except for obviously the Aura one, because I'm choosing to use that as a mat. And I always, if you haven't seen one of my videos before, I always do my solid hot foiling at the same time as the foiling. It's much easier to store a piece of foiled cardstock than it is that negative foil. I don't want that negative foil to get damaged in storage. So much easier to do it this way. Sometimes I'll use that negative hot foiled image. Sometimes I'll use that negative piece as a mat around my cards. And sometimes I'll use it for die cutting. So any of the pieces that I don't use in the video today, I'm going to be using those for die cutting. So with my foiling already done, I am going to take those foiled pieces and I'm going to do my Betterpress part of these cards. So the first 2 cards are going to be foiled and better pressed. The second 2 are only going to be using the Betterpress system. I have 5 different ink colors that I'm using. I chose that DIY card and put some cardstock on there for colors that worked well with it, but I'm actually not using those cardstock colors. I'm just using ink colors. So I have 5 different distress inks here that I'm using. We have Tattered Rose, which is a light peachy pinky color. Then we have Gathered Twigs, which is a kind of a medium brown. Then Ground Espresso, which is a dark brown. And then I have 2 blues. I have Salty Ocean and Prize Ribbon. I'm going to be using a combination of different ones on my different cards, but I'm going to be using all of those colors between all of the cards. So I'm just telling you all of the colors because I can't, when I'm looking at my video, I can't always tell exactly which brown I'm using. So the darker one is the Ground Espresso. The lighter of the tones of the 2 is the Gathered Twigs. This here is Salty Ocean Distress ink. And I like to ink my pads, and then I use a dry microfiber cloth to clean off that acetate. If by chance I get any of that ink on the background, I want to wipe it off. I don't want to leave it on there because sometimes when I'm using, especially when I'm using Betterpress cardstock, not so much with Hammermill cardstock, when I press or when those plates press into the cardstock, sometimes that cardstock touches the acetate and I want to avoid transferring any ink. So I try to be very vigilant about wiping off my acetate with a dry microfiber cloth, and then I can reduce the possibility of that ink transferring. And this is especially helpful when you're working with pads that are larger, like these distress pads. They're a lot larger than Betterpress pads. but they work well with Betterpress plates. You just want to be careful with that ink. And if by chance when you're inking or when you're wiping that acetate off, you move those plates, I just use the tips of my fingers on the side of the plate and move them right back to where they're supposed to be. Now, once again, these particular combinations or the placing of this, if it's a little bit off, it's not going to ruin anything. These aren't plates that have to be perfectly placed to create a solid picture. It's just a combination of different shapes. So if it's not exact, that's totally fine. And you can see, I was just pointing out where I got a little bit of ink transfer. Now, if that's something that bothers you, you can always foil the piece again and start over. I personally treat those things as challenges, as trying to find creative ways to hide that or creative ways to take your eye away from that. So I'm not replacing that piece. You can see where I have that ink towards the top right side of that foiled botanical piece. But what I'm going to do is that's where I'm going to put my sentiment, and it's going to cover most of that ink. The tiny little bit that doesn't get covered is very minuscule and you don't actually see it. So for my first card, I'm taking my foiled and Betterpress piece and I'm going to emboss it with that lined circles embossing folder. Because some of the images there have lined circles, I thought it went well with it. And I actually really liked the combination of that pressed and foiled background with the embossing and then the die cut solid hot foil piece on top of it. Now, obviously, any of these pieces or any of these steps that I'm doing, you can omit. If that's not your cup of tea, if you don't really like that, you absolutely can omit that step. I just thought it was an interesting way to have a lot of visual texture with the different colored inks as well as the foil, and then the physical texture with that embossed background. Now, to make my sentiment pop off the page a little bit more, I used that Salty Ocean Distress Pad and I did some light ink blending over top of it. That way it's going to show up on my background. My solid hot foiled piece that I'm using as a mat has been trimmed to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8, and my image piece was trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. Now, when I do my embossing, I emboss a full 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch piece. Often when you're embossing, it changes the shape of the paper. It shortens it, whether lengthwise or widthwise. Sometimes it's not the same. So I always like a larger piece to emboss and then I trim it down afterwards. So once it's trimmed, it's the right size. To glue everything together, I'm gluing it together with some Barely Art glue, and I have it in a fine line bottle, so it works perfectly for the background pieces as well as my smaller die cuts. For my second card, I'm using one of the solid hot foil pieces. This way it's going to pop off that background very easily. It's going to coordinate beautifully with the foiled botanical piece there. Now, what I'm going to do with the mat for this one is I'm going to take a large blending brush. This is a Spellbinders blending brush. I'm using the Prize Ribbon Distressing because this is the blue color that I used when I pressed that particular image. And obviously, I've shown you what color palette I'm using. Obviously that can change. You can use whatever color palette you want, but I really love the look of those browns with that pop of blue. I think it really makes it pop off well. I also opted to ink blend my sentiment, so my words are blue and it ties in with the blue pressed circles in my background as well as my mat. But if you want your sentiment to be a little bit more, a little bit less subtle, a little bit more bold, you can omit that ink blending of that. When in the video, it looks like you can't see the words at all. In real life, you can actually see the words quite well. However, in the video, the non-ink blended works or looks a lot better because there's a lot more contrast between the white and that foiling. So with my first 2 cards done, I'm going to do 2 more, and this time I'm only using the Betterpress system with those plates. However, I thought I would share some ideas to get a similar-ish look to the foil. It's definitely not going to look exactly the same as the foil, but just with using the Betterpress system. So this time I am using Betterpress cardstock. This is Porcelain Betterpress cardstock. So Betterpress cardstock is a little bit thicker, so we're going to see more of that letterpress recessed pressing with the Betterpress cardstock. I didn't use it for my first two cardstocks because the Betterpress cardstock really doesn't foil really well, and I wanted some nice clean foiling. So I used Hammermill for those, mainly because of the foiling. I wanted to make sure that I got some nice clean foiled images. But for this, because I'm only using the Betterpress system, I'm using the Betterpress cardstock. You could also use watercolor cardstock as well. That would work well because it's nice and thick and you would still get that recessed color or recessed the pressing in there basically. So I'm just going through with that registration template. I always tape it to the base of my Betterpress system. That way I know that that is not going to move on me. Again, if by chance while I'm cleaning off my acetate piece, if it moves, I just use my fingers on the side of the plate and slide it right back in. Each one of those pieces has different colored outlines to them showing you exactly which pieces are intended to be colored similarly or to be pressed at the same time. You don't have to follow that. You can press them individually all if you want, or you could do them all in different colors if you want. Now, once I have the background piece, everything but that botanical piece, I'm using my embossing powder tool to make sure that there's no wet ink left on my background there. For this, I want to heat emboss this botanical piece, and I'm going to heat emboss it with some gold embossing powder, and that's going to give me a similar-ish look to my foiled botanical piece in the first or second card. I can't remember which one I did in which order. I kind of went back and forth between the two. So by heat embossing, we're going to get a metallic looking botanical leaf here because I'm using gold metallic embossing powder. And by using that embossing powder tool, that makes sure that this embossing powder is only going to stick to my leaf and that Versamark ink. It's not going to stick to the ink that has already been impressed onto my background. So once I have taken all of the excess powder off and put it back into the package, I can use my heat tool to melt that powder. And like I said, we're going to get a similar look because we're going to have a metallic leaf. It's obviously not going to be the same as that foil because that foil has a holographic look to it, but it gives you a very similar vibe to it. So it's a way to get a similar look without having a hot foil system if you don't happen to have one or if that's not your cup of tea. Now, to make the background just a little bit more interesting and to tie that gold in just a little bit more, I have the Spellbinders watercolor mixing set and I have the little gold pot here. I took my Mighty Mister and I misted that little pot with some water, blended it with my Yasutomo brush, and then I'm just doing some splatter on the background, just changing it up a little bit. Now, another thing that you could do is with the previous collections from Dina Wakley, there are some splatter plates there. There's also a little script one. You could mix and match these sets with those sets if you wanted to create some new looks with them as well. I opted to not bring those out and to just leave or just to do splatters with that water color mixing set instead. But that's another option. If you're not comfortable doing splatter on your own, that's another option. To give this outline a gold finish, you could use gold specialty cardstock. I'm choosing to use some gold embossing powder. So I have my scrap piece of paper there. I made a line with some embossing powder. I'm taking the side of my cardstock and I'm rubbing it on my Versamark pad, and then I'm dragging my edge of my paper in that gold embossing powder to create that edge. Now, this is not going to be a perfectly symmetrical edge. This is going to be some areas are going to be a little bit thicker, some are going to be a little bit thinner, but it works perfectly with this mixed media style that these plates have. And it's just a different way to get a gold edge that I like doing sometimes, but not every card suits it and not every look suits it, but it does suit this really, really well. If you wanted it to be perfect, you could get some double-sided tape and then do the heat embossing. However, I typically, if I want it absolutely perfect, I will use some gold specialty paper or something like that instead. Now for the mat for this, once again, the mat is trimmed to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. I used that prize ribbon distress ink and did just some light ink blending around the edges. My pressed piece is trimmed down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. For the first 3 cards, I kept my mat really, really tiny. I wanted it to frame it and to complement it, but I didn't really want to take any attention away from the modern botanical mixed media style of the collection of images in there. So I kept my cards very, very simple as well. I didn't change the placement of the plates. However, you certainly could. You could get creative with them. I wanted my cards to be very, very simple, but just beautiful, basically. So this particular one, I also used that prize ribbon on the sentiment. Now you may have noticed I didn't do any Betterpress sentiments. You absolutely could do Betterpress sentiments. You could do them just with plain ink, or you could heat emboss them like I did the botanical piece. I opted not to because I had so many sentiments from the foiled ones I did. I opted not to repeat that, but you could certainly do that if you don't have a hot foil system and you want some sentiments. You can either do them with ink, or you can do some heat embossed sentiments as well. Now for my fourth card here, I'm using the other press plate. One of the registration press plates is called Growing and one is called Flourishing, and I keep mixing up the two, so that's why I'm not naming them in the video. I'll have them linked in the description so you can see which one is which. They're also very similar to each other. I do really like, though, that one of them has that die that works with it. I love the fact that you can die cut that botanical piece as well. So these pieces are really, really easy to use, and you can see that every single time I do ink my plates, I go in with that dry microfiber cloth and I clean up the background just to make sure to keep everything as clean as possible. Once I have this background done, I'm going to do the same thing as I did before. I'm going to heat emboss that botanical piece. For this particular card, I'm using some Walnut Stain Distress Glaze. This is an embossing powder that is transparent, so if the lines were a little bit thicker, you'd be able to see the detail of the pressed images underneath it. Because they're so thin, you likely can't, as well as the fact that the walnut stain is fairly dark. But I once again use that embossing powder tool on that background to absorb any moisture from any of those inks that I've already pressed there. I used my Versamark pad on the botanical piece, and then I pressed it onto that background, put it onto some scrap cardstock, and then I'm pouring that Walnut Stain Distress Glaze on top of there. Now, if you happen to have some, say, black metallic embossing powder, I meant brown, metallic embossing powder, that would work as well. The Distress Glaze doesn't have a metallic look to it. It is brown, and I wanted it to look similar-ish to that coffee bean glimmer foil. It's not going to look exactly like it because it doesn't have a metallic finish to it, but it is going to give you that shiny raised look. So it's going to have a different finish from the other pieces in that background. For this particular one, I want to use the lined corners embossing folder on my background. So at first I trimmed this down to 3 3/4 inches by 4.5 inches. I end up trimming it down even more, so my image piece ends up being 3.5 inches by 4 3/4 inches. My embossed piece is going to be 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. But I do want to add a little bit of visual texture to that background. I have some fawn cardstock here, and I'm using that Gathered Twigs distress pad to ink the opposite side of my embossing folder. I did use some Best Ever Craft tape to tape it in place. At this point, I wasn't sure if I wanted to ink it multiple times to get a really dark brown, or if I just wanted a little bit of visual texture with a lighter brown. I opted to just do the one inking and just do it the one time. If you're just doing it one time, you don't necessarily need to tape it in place. I always like to tape it in place when I'm inking my embossing folder so that I don't have to worry about that piece of cardstock moving on me. Now, because some of that background was taped in place, it didn't get any ink on it, so I took that tape off, and that's why and then I trimmed it down. And that's also one of the reasons why I like to keep my cardstock a little bit bigger than I'm wanting it for my card, so that I have room to do that. For my image piece here, I'm taking that Salty Ocean Distress Pad and just doing a really light ink blending around the edges. It's going to frame it in. It's not taking any attention away from the images on that piece there, but it's just bringing the blue in another area. And by keeping it very, very soft, we're not overwhelming anything at all. When I glue down this embossed piece here, because there's so much texture to it, I do make sure that I put some of that glue on the areas that are going to be touching my card base. I want to make sure that it's glued on really well. So you do want to make sure to be fairly liberal with your glue to make sure that you've got some nice solid adhesion between the two layers. Then I did the same thing with my image piece, making sure that I have a good amount of glue that's going to touch all the different areas of that embossed background. For this one, I'm using one of the solid hot foiled sentiments, and that way it shows up really, really nicely on that background. But once again, you could use the Betterpress plates with some of the walnut stain distress glaze and emboss your sentiments. The only thing, you can't negative emboss them the way you can do the negative solid hot foiling, but you could emboss them and use one of your distress pads to do ink blending on them, to customize them, to make them match. So that is that finished card, and the cards have a very similar look to them because the composition is similar-ish, as in there's a combination of a botanical with some different circles, but I just really love the look. This is one of those things that is not necessarily what I tend to gravitate to and tend to naturally do. Modern stuff isn't really something that comes naturally to me, but I always love doing things that are a little bit outside the box for me, and I absolutely love this first one with the combination of foiling, pressing, plus that embossed background. I think it has some really nice visual texture to it. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.